So once again, I'm Megan and I'm the Livestock and Forage Program Manager for LARA. And we're really excited today to have Grant Lastiwka talk about how to choose the right forage species and varieties for your perennial forage stand. Grant has a lot of experience and he's really knowledgeable in all things perennial forages. So we're really excited to have you. And if anybody has any questions throughout the webinar, you can type them in the chat and we will address any questions at the end of the webinar. And with that, Grant, I'll let you take over.
All right. Well, I thank you very much, Megan. And it's exciting to hear all the things that are ongoing and the opportunities to do them now that we've hopefully come on the other side of a health issue that has been predominant in this country for a while. Certainly, we're looking forward to all these activities, and I hope I can help you a little bit tonight. I jokingly tell Megan that I'm armed and dangerous when it comes to forages, because it is very humbling. The more we know, the more we know there is to know. Every year is different. And as this snow that arrived so very quickly for us down here after such a long period of lack of moisture, there's surprises everywhere. So the answer is it depends a little bit in the forage one. So I'm going to talk about forage species and varieties because when we talk about the species, we're talking about a plant that we know, maybe a smooth brome grass. We start talking about a variety, it could be Carlton, it could be a northern variety that's its subspecies. So, and the point of all of that is there's differences. And some of the places where we say, oh my goodness, you can't plant an alfalfa in a wet area. Well, Dr. Joseph Papadopoulos from the Maritimes has bred A.C. Truman, which is an alfalfa that does tolerate wet feet. And it is exciting because it actually comes from a BC variety called Rhizoma. And some of that germplasm is still in the works up in the Fort Vermilion area because one of the young gentlemen I know was keeping it alive and going. And it was exciting. So the point of all of this is trying to understand what we've got as opportunities in taking advantage of species and varieties. And so when we do, in fact, let's have a better look at it. And I know from that standpoint, it sounds like a little bit of a juggling act. It's a little confusing and everything, but we'll try to break it down into pieces. So when it comes together, it is in fact more easy to understand what's going on. Now, I don't know why you need a car in this setting, but needless to say, this individual did have the fortune of having a car. But a one path in, no, I don't think that's the story, but will certainly give you a more narrow road to understanding for yourself. The fact we're up against some basics, and that is more true all the time with the higher grain prices, the challenges we're seeing in the forage industry, is that we've got lands that have got more components that have to be dealt with. And how do you deal with them? And that maybe is one of the reasons why more people are looking to mixtures versus monocultures. And there was a time where Alberta Agriculture, where I worked for many years, talked about monocultures and keep it simple. And yet at the same time, now companies sold mixtures. And myself, I guess, for many years, I was a mixture fan for a number of reasons. But the idea of having it on variable landscape, what works in one part of the farm doesn't work in the other. And depending on where you're coming from to this webinar, you know that if you had land that had conifers on it, land that had deciduous trees, land that was low, land that was sandy and high under maybe those jack pines, what do you plant there? How do you keep it really productive? Because you can. And the last thing you want to do is plant all the farm to something and then find the fact that there's many poorer areas that should have been dealt with differently and could have been dealt with differently. And with all of that now is climate limitations. Um, and more so because of the landscape, probably the soils could be rocky areas that have more limitations to water holding capacity, or heavy clay that has a lot of water holding capacity. And so as we get no moisture for long periods of time, how can we manage with the species chosen that can be drought avoiders and give us productivity through that time? And we'll go from there. So where do you start? And this where do you start part, to me, is going to be just walking us through some of the principles and tools that are available. And we'll start with some of those things. And species and variety, as we talked about, knowing that the separation through plant breeding becomes even more broader. And it always starts with your end use plan, your goals. Is it a hay or is it a pasture? What kind of management system are you putting on it? Is it going to be silage? Is it going to be hay then grazed? Is it going to evolve to a pasture? Is it a system where you use a short duration forage and then put it back into grain crops? Well, what management are you going to impose on that is really going to determine which species can fit for you better or not as well. The soil type is a big part of it. And right away, solonetzic or saline, but the soil pH limits us with a lot of species. And yet at times we're surprised, and I'll share some of that as I go through. Certainly texture, it's a sandy soil, it's a heavy clay soil. What plants do well there? And problems, as we talk about problem soils, what is your main problem? So as you look at that, I challenge people to look at it too, and look at it in context of how large an area it is of the land that they're managing to and wanting to plant, because maybe it is land that you should plant separately to something else that fits that need much better, instead of just saying, let's plant a mix that goes across it well. And now we know that we've got plants that are better drought avoiders. And we'll look at that a little bit with the root system perspective. But legumes are so often better drought avoiders because they got deeper roots, and their ability to, in fact, lift water, their ability to supply their own nitrogen to themselves so they can search for water better through the soil as deficiencies arise. And as we look at grasses, we've got grasses that are going to be able to tolerate some drought. One of the exceptions I know with soil moisture is a plant like a lot of us look at, reed canary grass. Reed canary grass is the one maverick that can withstand drought and yet withstand water, logged soil, ponding even. So there are some things when we start looking at soil moisture we can do and plan around some species. The species adaptations, and that's one of the things that we're finding some science more so just lately about alfalfas, when we look at dormancies, when we look at hardiness, and we realize that work that Dr. Annie Clausen's, Dr. Vern Barron, and others are doing across Canada with the Alfalfa Project is in fact showcasing that they are separated actually more than you think. So hardiness and dormancy might not be the same quite thing. So I can tolerate that cold, and maybe I can have a longer season of growth than you think. And of course, now with the weather the way it is, be it insects and other things, and the weather changes, the disease tolerance is important, because it seems like diseases are moving more north than we like. And the weather patterns we have for diseases are allowing for, I suppose, some of that to be a little more of a challenge. I did throw at the bottom of the species and varieties is you get, and people will say, well, make sure you get certified seed. That is not as clear cut as people say. Quality seed is a function of you looking at the seed certificate and determining if it is. Certified seed has categorizations and standards, but common number one actually has very good as well. I worry when I get into common number two. That one is really one to worry more about. But a seed certificate might determine I don't want that species. I don't want that variety because of some of the weeds it's got in it. Maybe because of some of the poor germination. When we get down to common, it allows more tolerance of poor germination. But the seed certificate sets you up for some of that hard seed content, so you know that maybe it is going to be a little more variable germinating. But the seed certificate, the best adapted species, and for most producers, I often say most persistent. Keep that in mind, because I know you say you reseed the alfalfa every 5 years, but why is it your hired man tells me that's 7 actually? That one's 11 years old. So my thought to some of this is ask yourself, what do you need for persistence, and manage that accordingly. The thing to me is brought forward in a couple of ways. One of them is that species, to me, I put it in red here, it is crucial. It is so much easier to be a better manager if I've got the right species there. It's more challenging if I don't, but I can certainly manage to get the most out of a species by doing a lot of things right. The environment that is imposed on it, that's where you'll hear comments about it was a really dry year and we didn't have high production. And I'll share some of the yields that Megan and Kelly and the Lara team have put together in their perennial forage trials in 2021 when it was a dry year. And yeah, you don't expect to see the yields as high. So environment determines what happens. And at times it sets the stage for, remember, it's a perennial species. What happens in the present is setting the stage for what is going to be in the future. And it is because one year begats another. It is a sloughing from one year to the next, be it root systems, be it plant populations. And we'll look at the mixtures that the Megan and team have looked at and some of the composition of that. But again, in the back of your mind, say to yourself, species is one component, but I'm looking at a number for myself. And the one thing we run into, mix. We look at species and then we don't at times say, hold on, they're going to be planted together. This is going to be a mix. And I found some advantages in mixes that I don't have. The winter kill in my mind on my orchard grass, if it's in a mix, my tall fescue, if it's in a mix. I don't understand fully why. Maybe it isn't, some of the diseases are more spreading over species, but I know that in my own mind, there are some benefits of mixes that I've seen over the years. So it also determines the seeding rates, the fertilizer, all those things. So when you're starting talking about mixes, in my own mind, when you're talking about species, you're starting to look at a bigger picture. And that to me is part of an opportunity to keep a plant in a stand longer simply by knowledgeably managing it, understanding how it grows, understanding some of its needs that need to be better met. And I know that some of our legume species don't replenish themselves well after a regrazing. And when you run into a bird's foot trefoil or a sandfoin, those plants need to be managed for residual. The same is true of Sicer milk vetch. Alfalfa doesn't, and it will bounce back and recoup itself. Those other three wait till fall time to do more recouping. So again, your management to maintain balance comes into play. This is an older publication, but it's available on the internet. You can punch it in and up it comes. And mentors to the Lakeland Applied Research Association in terms of Harvey Yoder, Jerry Ellard, all had contributions that went into this publication over the course of time. So when you look at the people that contributed to this, there was hundreds of years, literally, of experience that went into it. And so the Alberta Forage Manual on the internet, though some people would say it's dated, it's in the late 2008, I think 2010 maybe, it's still got some really heavily accurate information and well put together that helps with understanding, because the people that did it were so impeccable with integrity and knowledge. Arvid Austin, Myron Bjorgi, Harvey Yoder, a number of those people, as I said. We've got tools that a person can look to. And this tool put together by the Peace River Forage Seed Association, I shouldn't say Peace River Forage Seed, I should have said Peace River Forage Association of British Columbia, but they put this together for the Peace region, and I find it really good. There's another version out, and I'll talk about it in a second as we get to it. But again, things on the internet that you can use that give you information support in decision making. You're not on your own. Using a seed mix calculator, so you can do your own choosing and adding or taking away of species till you develop a mix. And companies do put together mixes for you if you plan early enough in the year. So if you come there, I'd like such and such and such. What do you think of this? And if you get the right person that knows their stuff, they'll talk with you about it, and you can go back and forth through it. The Forage U-Pick, and I worked on this quite a bit myself, and the Beef Cattle Research Council has put it out through for available to people. The one thing about this Forage U-Pick is be very specific in your needs, run them very narrowly, because one of the biggest challenges with interactive or in fact integrative is the system complexity. And so all of a sudden, when I start looking at putting something together, it'll say, oh, you don't want to do that because you'd be concerned about something. When I look at it, I think, I can get around that. I'll just use a little more sulfur fertilizer. I'll maybe use some phosphorus. I'll set up a stand for success. I'll manage more for success. So though you feel a stand might only live for 4 years, seed set of that stand allows it to come back. And that's why so many of you I know up in the Bonnyville, St. Paul area will run into clover years, we'll call it. I do too down here at Innisfail, where about 2 years ago there was clover. There were a lot of legumes coming back. Why were all these legumes coming back? Well, it was a cool, dry spring, and the grasses didn't get off to a good start. All of a sudden, my seed bank in the soil became more competitive. And because of that, those little seeds got going. And it could have been past management on the grasses as well. But lo and behold, use Forage U-Pick with very narrow selections so that you can, and as you broaden your selection criteria, as different species drop by the wayside, ask yourself if you're still comfortable thinking they do or not. Again, another good tool to look at. One of the other big tools I'm always fond of is regional local. And anytime that the Lakeland Applied Research Association is carrying out perennial forage trials, and Megan was nice enough to share them with me, and this is what you guys look at every year when you collect this data. And I know it's in your annual report, but I'd be remiss if I didn't pay credit to it. And at the same time, I know some of you coming to the workshop are not just from this area, but there are other groups around the province working with Megan and team also on their own areas with perennial forages. So what are they finding in some of this? I will get into that, but I want to say that be careful with seed company mixes. They're their mixes, not your mixes. And when they do, there's a number of things they put into it. They're trying, and I'm not doing this to get anybody in trouble. It's just reality, because if somebody says, I don't want to spend more than $50 on a forage seed per acre, just because it's seeded for 25 years, and they're willing to spend $40, $50, $70 an acre on canola, somebody has to satisfy that need. And so economies, ease of doing and such, seed companies do try to work with you. They know if you're going to be a long-term customer, you've got to be satisfied, but they don't want to really cause you a lot of grief. But remember, I've had people call me and say, what do you think about cover crops? And that's going to be in a session that is lined up a little later when we talk about seeding and in this series. But the reality is, I say, what are you planting? And they'll say, well, I'm planting this mix. I've got Italian ryegrass in it, perennial ryegrass. Those are annuals in Bonnyville, in St. Paul. And so all of a sudden, you've got your cover crop already in there. So consider that more carefully. Lower seed costs. Timothy is such a small seed, it doesn't take hardly any of it. And when I was talking to one of the people in your area, the Mistles at St. Paul, I don't mean to name drop, but I do draw on local people for content. You know, Terry said, if I put 3% of Timothy in a stand, that could be quite a bit. That's the point. You look at a label and you say, oh, it's got 3% Timothy. That's not very much. Well, it's got so many million seeds per square foot when it's got, million seeds per pound. But when you put in 3% in a mix, it actually can be quite a bit. And the hardiness or change of cultivars, depending on what's in the mix, you're looking at it. Oh, yeah, actually this year we put in a different variety of alfalfa in that mix. Well, I'd like to know which one it is, because I'm trying to understand how well it's going to do, or orchard grass or tall fescue. Percentages of each. The thing about percentages is they are by weight, not by percentage of seed in the bag, not by percentage of stand so often that you're going to get. You need to ask them, but it is how every company does it, because it's the one constant. Seed size does change. Percentage pounds in a bag, that doesn't change. It's pretty consistent. So anyway, percentages on the bag. And again, anytime you're doing a mix, ask for the seed certificate, because at times a company can say, well, we don't have it here. Then say, I know your parent company has it. Can you please get it for me? And they will get it for you if they want you as a customer. And so the mix, though confounding, isn't as confounding as you think. And the other one about seed company mix is coated or non-coated. We'll leave this for the seeding section. I'm not going to talk coated or non-coated here, but when we talk about that section, we'll share more. I'm bouncing to some of the great work that you're doing locally. I'm so pleased to see this. This was something that when varietal trials were carried out across Canada with perennial forages, there was comparisons across Canada, and the site you use at Fort Kent was a site that was used across Canada for years and years. But the reality is all of that was stopped. And it was stopped as the federal government saw no need for that. So now you've picked up the torch and are doing it. The first thing when I start looking at the legume trial of 2021 is I look at what's seeded and I look at yield, but I'm also looking at it when it was established. I am trying to get a feel for the longevity in the stand right away, because so often research, and you guys, thank goodness, this is 5 years. It was planted 5 years ago. The majority, the varietal trials that were done for years by Ag Canada were 3-year trials. How many people have a 3-year pasture? How many people have a 3-year hay stand? Well, and that's part of what you're looking for. The other thing is watch the years. And when I asked Megan, I said, Megan, do you want me to use 2021 data? Because I think it was very dry for you. In many cases, it wasn't fair to some species. But that is an important thing, because if you're looking at that, it tells you something. Oh, that was a really dry year. Well, that legume likes more moisture. That legume can tolerate more drought. Well, the picture's unfolding a little differently. So you're looking at, oh, that was a really wet year. So when you're looking through data, the best is regional and local. This is wonderful, but at the same time, the year-to-year variability, the length of time it was there, you're getting a feel for these different varieties, and there are many varieties out there by different companies. And you're looking at a stand that was 5 years down the road. I haven't looked at quality. I can't look at everything with you here today, but in my comment on quality, it is a little more similar across varieties generally. Um, but I do know when I add a legume to a mix, I do increase quality. Yes, I know that. When I look at these different varieties, of course, I'm looking at the fact that Sicer milk fetch is lower. I've got to say, you know what? The seed company said it's slower to establish. Well, you know what though? It's a low growing species. How much was left below 3.5 inches of the cutter bar? That is something that does tell me be a little careful. I can see that Oxley right up here had a pretty good yield, and in theory, it and Veld will both be low. So I can't answer that. There's always questions that come up with, but we've got a variety of different alfalfas to see how they perform. And as we look at them and look at the average, it gives us a feel for what has happened with perennials and monocultures of perennials. Why I put this in here, this was the 2029, but it was harvested in, whoops, I guess I forgot to circle that, in August of 19, so 2 years difference. So Megan's got history in here for you. So this is a wetter year. You're looking at productivity. I also look at this number, and it's not to say the work was good or bad. The coefficient of variance in forages, perennial forages, and when I worked with the research teams at Lacombe, is a real challenge. It's not like annuals. It's because the data is got compounded complexity. And so a coefficient of variance is higher. So we're looking at outliers here, and we saw the Mountain View did falter. So the Mountain View Sandfoin didn't do as well because it's got a B, but it is only significantly different actually from Rangelander, because the ABs mean that Rangelander and all of these fall into the A category. The Mountain View only categorized itself with the B. It still tells me trends. And as you can see, because of the variance being as great as it was, it is telling me trends that I'm going to have to look at and decide what I want, but I'm still looking at content, information, and reasons why. And just like that, I didn't have the Sandfoin reasoning there, I don't think, but I think the Sandfoin was also dying out of the stand. And when I look at this one, I'm seeing right away, maybe the Fistulolium is not something I really want in my stand because it won't live long. And so that was 21 data when it was seeded, in fact, in 19. So 2 years down the road, I don't see it there, but I've got a reason for not seeing it. And I start comparing all these others in yield and everything and how well they've done, all the different varieties and species. And again, the other thing that I haven't said is the opportunity to go out and look at them. Because when you go out there and look at them, it's an opportunity, in fact, to see how they look and then get, oh, that's the one. All right. now I know what it looks like. So you're looking at yield, but you're also looking further. This is where mixtures, this is more similar what producers would do. And that is something the varietal trial that was across Canada never did, was the mixture one. And established in 2017. And then, as you can see, notes, Mountain View Sandfoin, minimal amount in the stand, winter killed. And so you'd look at that right away and say, oh, I'd be really concerned about it. And I would and I wouldn't, because I'm looking for information. Now I'd go to Megan and talk to her a little bit. Well, you know what? The Fairview site had Mountain View 4 years later, still at 20% of the legume stand.
Hey, Grant, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now, Megan?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, my apologies. Okay, thank you for that. When we start looking at mixtures, I get really excited because we've got a grass and a legume compared here. And to me, that's crucially important because I look at economics and I know more than ever on these perennial pastures, we've got to up the game to compete a little more against the grassland to grainland component. And what we've got here in the trial is more hardy legumes in terms of spreader 5 alfalfas, the yellowhead alfalfa. And the yellowhead alfalfa is one that, as you can see, as the stand gets older, the productivity of it and everything, it's not going to regrow like a spreader 5 would even. It's not going to regrow like a sandfoin probably would, especially as you get past the 1st of July. But I actually have spreader 4 at our place and yellowhead at my place and sandfoin at my place. So I do know them myself and manage them in a grazing system. So I understand them to quite a dangerous degree. But the point of it all is that time will also sort out differences. And as you start looking at whether it's a lack of longevity in the sandfoin showing itself, or whether it's simply a consistent productivity of yield in the yellow blossomed alfalfas that are less common across the province, but because of producers and people like Harvey Yoder in your region who did keep one of the yellow blossomed alive. Anik would not have been kept in the system at all if Harvey wouldn't have taken over the rights to carry it, so it would be maintained. And in the end, another one sprung from that because they started to see value of it. So talk about leaders coming from out of the Lac La Biche and the Bonnyville, St. Paul area. You guys certainly are there. Anyway, my point to the mixtures. The thing about the mixtures I'm looking at this slide is over time. And seeing, in fact, that when I look at the yellowhead, I see that it's gone up in content. And that's what I've found in multi-cut plots and other things is yellowhead. And that was what happened in grazing trials. They found it increased and they went, oh, hold on here. Maybe, and here you can see spreader 5 is hanging on still very good. Not so good there maybe, but close. It's still close. And it's only 3 years. But the point of all of this is looking at the percent difference change and how it's handling it and staying in the mixture. I did want to change, I can only talk so long on that because I want to get us through the content, is in fact looking at the mixture negatives. And as I look at the mixture negatives is Mavericks that don't fit in as well. They challenge you to take over. and they're difficult to manage. They give you more unpredictable results. So mixtures can have challenges, and that's something to talk about more. They do address some crucial areas on landscapes, but as we earlier shared, maybe that is even a big enough area that you say, I'm going to seed it differently. And I'm going to seed the other area to something else that's, going to do well. I know that I've got some areas where water's going to stand. Maybe that's where my Timothy and birds of a trefoil is going to go. Maybe that's where my reed canary grass and Timothy and birds of a trefoil go. I'm going to keep the pubescent wheatgrass and the smooth brome on the areas that are higher because I know they're going to give me more yield. They're going to be more risk averse there. And then I've got the best species for the best situation, though I'm getting different hay production types from different areas or different grazing types. Now the wonders of managed grazing, controlled grazing, maybe you can get some flexibility in there with your management to deal with that mixture. I also find that the mixture, for me, generally, if it's thought out well enough, is my highest productivity, my most stable. And so that's something that economies come in, productivity comes in, and stable yield over season. And soil health now. I know that the Soil Health, Western Canadian Conference on Soil Health and Grazing just sold out. And of course, Lara's been active working on that all year to bring that to you with you. And the fact is, yes, we're realizing that perennials can do some excellent things for soil health. Rules of thumb, why soils are so important. I always thought when I went to school, soil grew plants. Well, you know what? It's not right. Plants grow soil. And that's why we do have the soil types under jack pine that are very different than under deciduous trees in the boreal area up at Lac La Biche and Bonnyville. And we do have the prairie rich soils that grew under grasslands. Anyway, point there taken. Hay stands, I'm moving through so we can get some areas into, and we can even address questions after. I really have to look at the products I need. And if it's a horse customer, I've got to look at that. If it's a hay stand that has another need for a specific market, maybe it's straight grass. And how long we're going to maintain it. Maybe it isn't the stand where I pick the Dairyman's alfalfa. Maybe it's a stand where I pick a mixed cut alfalfa with more longevity. And number of cuts. I know that people from diverse areas maybe are on this call, and we run into people looking at the fact, oh, I've got irrigation. Oh, I'm in an area where I can get that kind of growth where I get, and dairy farmer neighbors are going to take 3 cuts off no matter what and only take it for 3 years. Harvesting method now. All of a sudden, I can harvest things that regrow and ruin a hay that's drying in a swath because the meadow brome and orchard grass are growing through it. No, I'm silaging it. It's round bale silage. So the harvesting method for hay means I can now choose them in a mix and get a lot of leaf production and more grass in the second growth, second cutting, because I've got a method of harvesting that's different. Now, that was brought to my attention when I was talking in BC and I was thinking haying. And they said, well, hold on here, we're using clovers now. And I thought, oh, good point. We can address a legume in an acid environment if, in fact, we have an option to plant something that isn't going to be a detriment for hay production because it doesn't dry well in a swath. But all of a sudden, now it's a round bale silage. Yeah, I can put it up. I've only got to lay it down for 4 days. I can get it off and turned around or in 3. And are we going to graze this also? Pasture mixes. So where we've broken down the legume side and the haying side a little bit, and the pasture mixes, this is how I have always thought of it. I know that pasture land is probably going to be the more marginal soil of the two, hays and pastures. I also know that I'm going to need to graze it at different times of year. So I need a soil protection in the system. And I do find that shag carpet, though it's not popular anymore, maybe in the house, but having it on the soil so the hoof doesn't go deep into the soil and pug the clay. I find that when I've got my quackgrass even there, I can get animals out in very wet weather and the stand just bounces back and keeps coming at me. If it was orchard grass or meadow brome or timothy with no creeping grass with it, I've had 3 years where that area where the cows milled never came back, but was very deprived of oxygen and didn't even infiltrate water well. So a little bit of creeping grass in a pasture is something I strongly consider, especially for a soil component. I really look for a grass that regrows. And the biggest thing about that is trying to get something that's going to be highly productive and regrows. I don't want regrowth maybe in my hay, but in my pasture, I sure do. And with that, the meadow bromes that were so popular and have been, the orchard grasses, if we've got the hardiness, the tall fescues, those kind of things can really regrow well. And then I have said to people, we got to feed the system. If we don't feed it with fertilizer, somebody's got to feed it with nitrogen. Maybe it's the legume. Maybe if the legume isn't fed, it's going to be lost in 3 or 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, but maybe it's going to make the grass more productive for every bit of that time. And our yield more productive, our stability more productive. And we pick our legume correctly. Maybe it's like in that annual report you had, maybe it is a spreader 5, maybe it is a yellowhead alfalfa legume that does stay in the stand or even increase, or maybe it's a sisal milk vetch that does in fact creep and accumulate over time. And I'm always looking in a pasture for suitability. And now with the soil component, root variation. I want roots to explore the soil and to draw on that soil. And if I've got my manure and urine going back on the landscape because of a managed grazing system, chances are that that deeper plant root and the manure and urine are all going to create a more stable ecosystem function in that landscape for a more productive pasture, a more stable pasture that is going to be resilient through adverse climate times. I wanted to put this in because of root depth and realizing that, yes, we can pick species that, like the smooth brome, orchard actually had more roots. Isn't that interesting? But the roots were more shallow than were, in fact, the case with the smooth brome. When we went to my Kentucky bluegrass, which is an invader, which does come in majority of pastures up at Bonnyville, St. Paul, any moisture area, some people will say, well, it's creeping red fescue. Well, you got to prove it to me. I want you to look first and see, because oftentimes creeping red fescue gets mistaken for Kentucky bluegrass. But I like Kentucky bluegrass too. It's just that it's got different attributes, and its attribute is a very close to the surface root system for great protection. So if I had a bit of it in with orchard grass, I always keep these competitive ones a bit low in a pasture mixture, because I really don't, I know that Kentucky bluegrass has got, and we'll talk about it in a minute, I'll share a reason why, but Timothy is so shallow rooted, less roots. So again, looking at your species. This was something posed and I read in 1996, and it stuck with me ever since. And we were looking at extended grazing. And with extended grazing, drawing a lot on work that was actually being done by Jerry Ellard and Harvey Yoder up in the St. Paul area and at the grazing reserve up there and other places. But a grass for all seasons actually was interesting, because to Norm Ward, it was his pasture. It was simply managed pastures. And that was his point, is he said, I can get later season growth as long as I take care of my grasses to get them to be healthy and productive and vigorous. And I can get the seasonable distribution of growth going well into the fall, as long as I manage for plant health. And so my grass for all seasons is a perennial mixed pasture. And it isn't at time, it's a combination of that management that Gordon Hutton had shared earlier, the environment and everything. There is no doubt, and this is a picture Harvey Yoder had taken, and I didn't put that on there. So my apologies, Harvey. It's the yellow blossomed alfalfa, and someone could say it's the snow along the trees, but it also was the fact there was more yellow blossomed, and it feeding the grasses with nitrogen and other components that are more complicated for us to talk here. But the benefit of having a legume in a stand, all I can say is now with nitrogen fertilizer being so expensive, a legume in a grass stand, and people say, well, how much, Grant? You didn't tell me how much. Actually, it's 30 to 60%. It doesn't have to be 100%, but you get those kind of differences. 100 pounds of nitrogen? Yeah, 30 to 60% and legume in a stand can really bump the yields up. And so we're looking at it being shared with manure and urine, or sloughing of nodules, animal performance, season of growth longer. There's lots of reasons why I have to put legumes in pasture stands. And up in the Willingdon area, my brother and I back in '87 started in fencing hayfields, and he's ran with a lot of alfalfa in his grass stands for pasture ever since. Why? Can't afford not to. Why can't afford not to? The production is just too immense, too much greater. And once we start looking at the mixture, once we look at that density and everything, where we get to a critical leaf index, that is where we look at mixtures, because mixtures can capture. People say, well, you know, cycles are renewable. Water cycles, mineral cycles, energy cycles aren't. If you don't get it, you lost it. And so I want to capture every bit of sunlight energy. Everybody can say, what's a leaf area index? Well, it's 3 to 5 square feet per foot. And somebody says, I need 43,560 square feet of solar panel. Well, I'm pretty stingy. I want 3 times that or 5 times that, because we can get, because of angular, vertical, broad-leafed, we can intercept 97% of the light, my apologies, to get to that critical leaf area index by having multiple species in the stand and capturing more sunlight. Because if we don't lose it, if we don't use it, we lose it. And this was a stand at Holden, and that was in October. And so what we were looking at there was, it was a new stand, albeit, but boy, isn't that a great pasture to put them in. It snowed the next day, and quite a bit came down, actually. This is a few years ago. My apologies for the dog that's barking in the background now that I can't use my headset. In contrast to natural grasslands, mixtures that are sown by humans are not going to stay in equilibrium. They're going to bounce around is the point. And if they are going to bounce around, they are going to go up and down. I look at grasses that elevate their growing point, saying to myself, those are more grasses for hay, because the growing point elevates. As the growing point elevates and the animal bites it off, they don't regrow as well. And if they don't regrow as well, then they're not my later season pastures that I wanted. I look more for multi-height growing points or basal leaves on my grasses that are growing for, in fact, grazing. And the basal leaves could be on my low-growing creeping red fescue or my Kentucky bluegrass. The multi-height growing points simply mean when I bite one, another one's coming. And that's what you get with orchard grasses. That's what you get with your meadow bromes. And that's why everybody loves them for that. Anyway, basal leaves. Sorry, I got to reprimand the dog. Anyway, now we talk a little bit about the multi-height growing points. The point of that is they have got a number of growing points coming that are elevating from the ground. Our elevated growing points, like our smooth brome and timothy, grow from the crown. So once they're bit off, they don't regrow very well because they got to start from scratch. These other grasses are setting up growing points that are coming, and Dr. Sedovic's going to talk to you a little bit next week about management of them for more productivity, and he's going to really share some exciting things. But the point of these multi-heights are they all give you an opportunity for a regrowth potential that fits a pasture system. The basal leaves on these grasses fit well into the low growth that comes so often. It varies a bit, but I even threw in grasses. Sedges aren't grasses, but actually I like my lowland species. And we graze rented land that has got a lot of the sedges, or the three-sided species, we call it. It's not a grass, but a grass-like species. And I'm quite happy doing it as long as I can get in there and the soil stability allows me to get in there earlier. But here's some of the grasses with the basal leaves. The grasses that tolerate the wet areas better. The meadow brome, 2 degrees. It doesn't like a lot of wet feed. And the orchard grass, be looking with it to get varieties that are more hardy. And that is a challenge because the varieties that were Canadian bred, we've got less Canadian plant breeders and more companies that are larger multinational, international companies. And so they've got their own orchard grasses and others. So we're looking for what works in your area for hardiness, asking the company, how's it working? Have you got 3 or 4 years of data on it? And that, in fact, was one of the things I'd asked because I wondered about orchard grass in your area. And I think it was Dave Mistel said to me, no, our Elba's been in for about 4 years now, so it seems like it's lasting. The tall fescue, I know the Courtney died in your stand. I've got Courtney here, and it's been here forever, and now it's about 15 years. I know that it's up at Dawson Creek and north of there. Chetwin actually is the person that grows it up there. So pick varieties that can manage. Courtney that you had and lost in your stand is one of the hardiness. So why did you lose it? I don't know. I know that's one I've got, and Courtney is a Canadian bred one where a lot of our tall fescues aren't. Key grasses for dry areas, the hybrid brome. This is something that's done well in Saskatchewan. For some people, they say, what is the difference? It's in between meadow and smooth. It has got more stem and upright leaf, not as much as smooth brome, but in fact more than meadow. Well, I'd rather grow leaves, but I know that as hybrids go, it fits in. It maybe is a little more drought tolerant than meadow, because smooth brome has been known to be more drought tolerant than meadow. Those, of course, hard to get Russian wild rye or to Altai right now. And if you grow Kentucky bluegrass anywhere, the Kentucky outcompetes the Russian and you don't get the establishment. So these two had many premises in the earlier years. I know in the special areas to the east of Alberta and your counterpart down the highway there in Chinook Applied Research Association in Oyen, those are part of their predominant pastures. Alfalfa, I have to spend a bit of time on here. And if I miss out on some others, it is more complicated. There are more than you can look at and understand so quick. So start asking questions. There, you don't see these names as much anymore. You'll see purple flower, yellow flower. The common one is this one. And this variegated or standard was a cross on these two. Siberian is a subspecies that is just growing in more cold climate, but the Mediterranean or Flemish was kind of the predominant. As we're looking at these multifoliates at the bottom, they are at times more challenged with hardiness. The low initial rate of digestion, there's only one out of there. It's called AC grazeland. And the idea with it was potentially lower bloat risk. It is and it isn't. Be careful with that one. But it is 2 degrees, giving us a grazing advantage for an alfalfa. The creeping rooted ones are more hardy, generally more dry land. And when people start looking at them, they really don't creep a lot. They've still got a great taproot. Don't run away from them for fear of, well, I want a taprooted one. They got a lot of taproot to them actually too. They creep slightly, but their claim to fame is more hardiness and drought tolerance, maybe. All these alternative legumes all have a place somewhere in the picture, and that's complicated, needs more discussion time, but all of them have place. The reason why is reseeding ability. Now we're exploring, and at times even invasiveness. Sicer milk vetch, bird's foot trefoil. In fact, the city of Cochrane complains about Sicer. The town of Innisfail, my town, complains about the bird's foot trefoil that's taken over the town below the mowing height. Well, the lawnmower spread it all through town, so it's through the school ground and everywhere. Yes, it's true. The yellowhead alfalfa, just because it's a favorite of mine that I think needs to get looked at differently. The clovers, because of seed setting. In 1986, yellowhead was planted at Melford. In 2016, that's what it looked like. You can still see the plot that was planted. Well, folks, that's a lot of years later. And with that in mind, you've got 30 years of productivity under the belt. Dwayne McCartney, who did the work on it actually with mob grazing, if you can believe it, and writes in the Cattleman. Dwayne took this picture and sent it to me. This one is part of the higher legume trial that Lakeland was involved with others, and looking at the sandfoin, but just looking at legumes. And you can see the seeds on the sandfoin. So the idea at times is seed set. And this was a seed that had fallen at Oyen, and Lacey Gould picked it up and showed it. There's the little plant starting to grow. Whether it survived or not, I don't know. But you can see the green. That is what we talk. Somebody says, well, you know, I don't know how well the seeds do. Well, I don't know either, but I know that I've got clover years. So chances are seed set on legumes and the minor use legumes of seed set are an opportunity. I've got to wrap this up pretty quick, but I just wanted to say we do have a bunch of legume choices. I have a real comma by white clover simply because it does not have the hardiness. And though the white Dutch or native, as people call it, keeps coming back, it does a lot by seed set, actually, folks. It's a creeping stolon above the ground. So I am more careful with white clover. I've got it down for wet areas. You can buy it and everything, but I don't count on longevity. A question by Sicer because of the fact of the length of time it takes to be a productive one. 7 years after I've seeded it, it is now where my cows are trying to get through a foot of snow to get, and it's all green under there. So it's a godsend. Alfalfa, because there's so many types. AC Truman, that Dr. Joseph Papadopoulos bred for water tolerance and waterlogged soil. Key legumes for wet areas? Well, not of the other alfalfas, not the sandfoin, but AC Truman might be one that does fit that bill. Look at it accordingly. And that's the point to it. I can't say no, it depends is the answer. The drier areas, it's getting a little slower. That's a biennial, but as many people know, it's a weed for many. I count on it, and with proper rests, it's coming in my laneways all the time. I've got the white, could be yellow. Both of them do well as are feeding the grass system and coming in the hard areas. The hay species mix, as I'm trying to wrap this down, I'm looking at the advantages of mixtures and where I have to put together things that aren't going to compete so great with the alfalfa, do well in drier areas, maybe do well, in fact, give me something that's got regrowth for the later cut system. And how much I put in there is all a conversation point. I had that in already. I'm looking at legume to feed a system. I'm looking at regrowth species and thinking more broadly than I used to. Soil Health Grazing Conference, that's why it's sold out with over 500 people at it. The reality is people are looking and saying, how can we manage things so that we're going to capture water, allow infiltration of water, release of water. When I never got any rain since the middle of July, how do I have grass still left now? Well, I captured and infiltrated and hopefully kept it going as long as possible. Why legumes in the system? Because there's a challenge to manage. They can cause bloat. It's because we now understanding we can manage in the mix. Watch the mavericks. The mavericks, the crested wheatgrass, the meadow foxtails. I didn't talk about meadow foxtails because I'm really against them. They are so prolific as a weed. They grow in wet areas that don't have soil integrity to allow the animals to get on them. By the middle of June, they're heading. If I could have got on them in the last part of April into May, but they're in wet areas where their strengths are and I can't get animals on it. And then they spread to my dry areas. So be careful with any of these that are managing you. I don't manage them, they manage me. Salt tolerant species, this is a topic to itself that's got challenges and needs more discussion, and its management highly much so. I maybe have waterlogged soil, so I put in L-site clover to include in the mix. Maybe I do have a water tolerant alfalfa, but I actually look at alfalfa to be, and when you're dealing with salt, it's a topic and a talk to itself, and you need to strategize and plan to build around the problem area with interceptor species. Alfalfa is a great interceptor species. Smooth brome can tolerate a fair bit of salt, but on the upland around is interceptor. Slender wheatgrass tolerates a lot and does pretty well, but doesn't last as long. Tall wheatgrass is really unpalatable, so cows don't really like it, but it tolerates a lot of salt. Green wheatgrasses have some invader properties, seed certificate concerns to them. I would love to see them if they were available without concerns. Tall fescue isn't one to really look at because I do think it fits well in the salt tolerant areas, the ponding a little bit areas, and the foxtails that are creeping at the bottom. I really caution putting them, but as somebody said, maybe that's what's going to grow. I would rather put a tall fescue, a slender wheatgrass together with ability maybe to put some L-site or alfalfa in a larger area, twice the size of the salt, to get by it. This is where I'm going to end, because why you chose and what is a combination of questions. What do you put for percent? How well do they establish? How well do they compete? And this is where it's leading into Dr. Sedivec next week, because stands change, they ebb and flow. They have, in fact, got a naturalization process that occurs with thinning, and a lot of that occurs based on management and naturalization on fertility. So what I get is not what I planted, but what I managed for. And the law of the most aggressive is something to watch for, because the species ebb and flow and change over time. And the law of the most limiting, I call them, because if I'm most limiting of a nutrient or something, it's going to limit the productivity and the future. If I've got the most aggressive in, it's going to. So I will manipulate the system watching those things so that I have got some good fertility of PKS to keep my legumes in the stand to start with. I'm watching for aggressive. If the meadow brome is growing too fast and taking over against the legumes, I might graze it early and harder and get off of it to allow for the legumes to come. So I can do some things here, and Dr. Sedivec's going to talk a lot. Megan, I'm going to stop here and pass it back to you. So if you want to take care of the questions and answers, please do so.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Grant. Looks like we have a question from Michael. He says, hi, I'm seeing more and more horse clients asking for low sugar hay. Is there a species that are better for producing low sugar hay?
The low sugar hay horse concept is, it's actually fructans, component of the sugars. And a stress plant is higher in fructans. And you know what's funny about that, Michael? You know what a horse pasture looks like, a lot of stress plants, right? So in fact, teff hay is an annual really, but some people grow teff because it is lower in sugars, yes, but it is a warm season that's lower in sugars, and it's only a 1-year plant stand. So it's not something I chase. So what I'm looking at more than ever is to try to talk with horse people a bit about not stress plants, the plants that are managed well, so they're not stressed for fertility and other things, not overly fertilized to be crazy, but and a little more maturity to them probably are going to be the lower sugar plants. Not a lot of species are developed for sugar. The perennial ryegrasses are, but that's really nothing here in Canada. That's Europe. And so we've got phylloliums and others that are higher in energy and sugar, but as you saw, they don't last in the stand either, as we talked about them earlier. So the lower sugar content would be from a low stress, more mature growth plant. And that's why a lot of horse people quite like Timothy, because it is fitting that bill. But if it's drought stressed, it can be higher in fructan, actually. People don't realize that. Are there any other questions, Megan?
We haven't had any others come in. If you would like, you can also raise your hand and I can unmute you if you're having trouble navigating the chat.
Hate to scare everybody all away. I know that it's a challenge with answers at times, but do take advantage of the expertise in your organization and do get out and see those plots and sites so that you can look and talk. And the key is fellow producers that are out there at the same day as you on a field trip, because what they're finding is going to set the stage for, oh, okay. And when they say that doesn't work for them, say why. And the point of all of this is I found so often the why part is, oh, that's not a problem for me. I can deal with that. The reality of it is you're always looking for in perennials. The answer is it depends. And I wanted a more stronger answer than it doesn't work for me. I want an answer, it didn't work for me because. And I do find that in the fertility balancing that can occur, the manure and urine going back on a landscape, the longer rests between grazings, allowing for the legumes to come on and be more productive, and managing for the short growing season at Bonnyville or Lac La Biche or the Peace, or even here in central and southern Alberta at Innisfail, where I am, often means that I'm out there topping plants early in the spring to get over them, just to challenge them to not grow heads and grow more leaves. And that's something that Dr. Sedovic, I'm sure, is going to talk about, and I don't want to take his thunder. But the idea behind it does pose the fact that we're going to have a stand that is going to be lasting longer and being more productive.
We have a couple more questions here. So Kyle asked, has there been much success for growing purple/white prairie clover in Alberta?
You can't get seed of it. I wish you could, Michael, or Kyle, my apologies. The that has been something it's a native species. It's very much dryland areas. The work that's been done, they're very high in tannins. They're higher than sandfoin or birds for trefoil in tannins. And yet at the same time, there's no seed source I know of. And that was something I went looking for about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, but I don't know if anybody's got any seed now that you could get. So my thought is it's going to be in an area that's going to be a drier area, probably. An area maybe with, I guess I don't know the exact habitat. I'm guessing pubescent wheatgrass, intermediate wheatgrass with it. Hybrid brome with it, I think, has been played without Dr. Al Nawasa at Swift Current. I don't know if Bart Lardner and the team up at Saskatoon have put anything with it. It could be Russian wild rye, maybe as well. But anyway, that's a long story.
We have one more question. So Michael says, I have another question. I cleared some land last year and planning to seed to grass in 2024. What best legume or grasses? I'm going to seed oats one more year. How can you test for acidity from trees in the soil?
The fact, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry. It's a soil test. So you go out and do a soil test. The comment about a soil test is be careful you don't water it down. And I mean this very much, it's not the wording, it's just the thought. If I went and sampled all of my parcel land, an example I'll give you is best this. I was talking to a person when I was working out of Rimbey as a forage specialist, and he said, you know, I have everything on my land. On the same quarter of land, he said, I've got land that's developed under conifers. It's got a pH of 4.5. On that same quarter of land, I've got land developed under probably poplar, aspen, or under willow, and it's going up to over 7. So find the area that you think is the thing about acidity, then test. If you're going to pull core samples from there, 0 to 6 or whatever is probably all you need for acidity. But you're simply looking at doing the pockets that you think are going to be the most prone. And when you do that, then you come up with a result for that area. Because if I sampled that farm at Rimbey, that gentleman told me, I'd go across the whole thing and come up with a pH of over 6. And it's because he had enough land that was pH 7 that it really buoyed up all the pH 4.5. The challenge with acidity too is that I thought I knew more, because we thought when we did the sandfoin project with Alberta Agriculture that sandfoin liked high calcium, high pH soils. All right, that's kind of seemed like a reasonable thought. And then Megan's counterpart, the Peace Country Beef and Forage Association, planted it on the soil at the Fairview Research Station that was 5.4 pH. And that's Dr. Akeem Omankanye doing the work and his technicians. So again, just like Megan and your team, they do a good job. And so, yeah, it's 5.84. Why would sandfoin then grow? And 4 years in, it was 18%. It started at 50, but albeit it was down to 18 after 4 years. But as he said, 2 years, the deer ate it, so they couldn't sample it because they were grazing it so hard. So no, my thought on acidity is that I would sample separate. I would look to the birds of trefoils. I would look to the Elsite clovers more to deal with that, or a red clover potentially. The 3 that tolerate as much acidity. There is an alfalfa, actually of Dr. Surya Acharia's program, AC Meadowview, that tolerates acidity more than others, just like Dr. Josip Papadopoulos' waterlogged soil alfalfa, AC Truman. Those are outlier alfalfas that actually work well in those environments. So do look at what is available, and you might have to go up into the piece to find that alfalfa, depending on who's carrying it. But maybe it is an alfalfa even that works, but it's a species to a variety. So you start looking for the variety that can tolerate it, just like we know some alfalfas tolerate salt more than others. And with that, usually not having the longevity we want. But so I don't know of any alfalfa with salt tolerance that has longevity yet, but there are alfalfas out there, but others aren't. So best legumes or grasses for that land. I'd want more information. I'd go to Megan and say, Megan, tell me, this is what I've got. This is the type of land it's on. I am a big fan of the meadow bromes. Huge. They are kind of rock stars. So I always look to the meadow bromes. Their breeding programs come out of Saskatchewan. And they're true Canadians, if you want to call that. Bill Bilgettu's carried on the program, so out of Saskatoon. So I'd say a predominant amount of meadow brome is what I'd want in a stand. That's a good, that makes me look good as a grazer. And it'll do relatively well unless it's waterlogged soil. And then it's not as good as an orchard or a tall fescue or a creeping red fescue. Because I'm guessing, Michael, you're from up in the area, someplace around Bonnyville or such when you're talking acidity. And so I'm talking species that kind of fit better there.
Perfect. Thanks, Grant. Oh, Michael says I'm west of Edmonton.
Okay. Being west of Edmonton, Edson, Mayerthorpe or whatever, you've got, Megan, are the GROW Gateway Research Organization part of the trials at Westlock? Are the West Central Forage Association part of the trials out there at, oh my goodness, they moved now, aren't they? They're not at Evansburg. They're at, kind of think of the place. Do you know if they're part of the trials with you?
I know that for sure West Central is, and I am fairly sure that GROW is as well.
So you've got Michael, Megan's just pointed you to two sources of, they would have their annual reports probably online, like Lara does, Lakeland Applied Research, that if you looked and you'd see how well they've done, hopefully with 3 or 4 years of data under their belt to see how it would be. But then, yes, the species I'm talking about probably would be still good. I'd look at orchard grass. West of Edmonton, it seems like orchard grass in the West Country does pretty well. It is pretty much a rock star out there in many ways, but stick with the varieties. Do not use Potomac. If anybody's selling it, I'm sorry, but I would try to stick with things that have got the hardiness of an orchard grass if I'm putting it in there, and I'd put it in a mixture blend. Because the monoculture component is where I'd be more worried about orchard grass. But if it's going to be doing well, I've got areas of orchard grass, Michael, that are taking over. Orchard grass does really well in certain areas. And so the hardiness of it, but I don't even know it came with hay. I can guess what it is, the old variety K probably, but there's Arctic, Nordic, AC Splendor, are all Canadian varieties. I don't know if you can get some of them anymore. But there are other varieties that some of the people are carrying that do have hardiness. Then I'd look at that, and I was just looking at my notes to see if I had any written down. Amba might have hardiness to consider as an orchard grass. But I know there's others out there. Just when you talk to the company, or if you're buying from, if it's no matter where you're buying, just say, I'd like more information. Could you help me? And they might send you to their forage seed specialist with the company. That it maybe because you're buying it local, maybe that person you're not as comfortable with because they say, oh, I don't know, they just told me to sell the seed. So go to your association. Beyond that, also don't be afraid to ask for going further down the path to their specialist in the parent office. And there's some people there that are pretty passionate about forages that have been around a long time. And they do have quite a bit of gray hair to answer that one for you. And you're looking for 3 or 4 years, or just say, do you have some customers? Can you give me some names? Would you send me to anybody? And that's the other thing. I do my homework. I'm not afraid to ask others what works for them. And like I said to you, if they say that didn't work for me, and I hate to say this, but if they said it was a horse pasture, unfortunately, I've got horse pastures too, but generally I try to rotation and graze my horses. So the orchard grass needs to be cared for a little bit, but it can last pretty good.
I think that's all the questions, unless anybody has one more last minute question.